The alien world of Zephyro was a planet of vast landscapes and towering structures. A place where the sky was an unbroken canvas of hues and light shimmered in every corner. Their civilization was built upon principles of strength, intellect, and the constant drive for expansion. They were a species who had long ago mastered the art of war and peace, both with equal precision. Yet amid this glory, there was a secret unease buried in the hearts of many. For the Zyphorians were not a race who valued weakness. They saw it as a burden, a flaw that could not be allowed to fester in their people. Their society was unforgiving in this regard, as it demanded strength and purpose from every individual born under their banners. Each person had a place to fill, each role determined by their inherent traits and abilities. For the Zyphorians understood that their future depended on their ability to grow, expand, and conquer any obstacle that stood before them. Reproduction was the cornerstone of their entire society. Every decision was made with the goal of ensuring the continued survival of their species. Yet there was something more to the Zyphorians, something that was often overlooked in favor of their technological achievements. Their ability to feel the depth of their own emotions was something that set them apart from the countless other species they had encountered in the galaxy. And yet it was a trait that was rarely discussed, as it was often seen as a weakness. Among the Zyphorians lived a young female named Nara. She was intelligent and capable of thinking far beyond the limits of those around her. Her research into the cosmos had earned her respect from the few who could see her potential. But there was one thing that set her apart from the others, something that rendered her useless in the eyes of the majority of the Zyphorian population. She was infertile, unable to bear children, and in a society that thrived on reproduction, this was a mark of shame. It was a cruel twist of fate for Nara, as she had done nothing to deserve this condition. And yet she carried the weight of her people's judgment upon her shoulders. She could feel the whispers behind her back, the mocking glances in the hallways of their cities, the pity that dripped from the eyes of those who spoke to her, but said nothing of her condition. They would never ask her to lead. They would never ask her to be a mother, to guide the next generation. Because in their eyes she was not truly a part of their future. She was a dead end, a flaw in the grand design of their people. The ridicule she faced was relentless. It came from every direction, no matter where she went, no matter how much she excelled in her studies. And her work, it didn't matter to them. She was still marked by her infertility, and they would never let her forget it. Zeth was one of the loudest voices in this cruel chorus. He was a young male of considerable status and strength in the Zyphorian hierarchy, and he made his mission to belittle Nara at every opportunity. He would often find her in the midst of her presentations or her quiet moments of research and make sarcastic remarks about her inability to contribute to the most important aspect of their species, the continuation of their bloodline. He would taunt her with words like, "What good is all your knowledge if you can't even produce offspring like the rest of us? Or maybe you should stick to reading your books, or the real Zyphorians go off to make the future." Nara's heart would sink every time she heard him speak those words, and though she would try to ignore them, they always seemed to find a way to linger in her mind, like a weight that refused to be lifted. Yet despite all of this, Nara remained calm. She never let the mocking of Zeth or any other Zyphorian break her composure. She would carry on with her work as if their words didn't matter, but deep down they did. They gnawed at her confidence and made her question her place in the world. Was she truly valuable? If she could not fulfill the purpose her people had set for her, was her intellect enough to make up for what she lacked in fertility? And despite everything, Nara knew that no matter how much she accomplished, she would never be truly accepted by her people. For her lack of ability to reproduce, she would always be seen as less than them, a failed product of their great civilization, a glitch in the grand scheme of their expansion into the universe. And so she lived with this quiet desperation, surrounded by brilliance, yet overshadowed by a fundamental flaw that she could neither control nor change. It was a lonely existence, one where her dreams were constantly overshadowed by the reality of her condition. But in her heart, Nara held on to something, a small flicker of hope, that maybe, just maybe, there was more to her life than the narrow path that her people had laid before her. Nara spent her days in the quiet corners of the research halls, poring over data that no one seemed to care about. Her findings were groundbreaking yet dismissed as irrelevant, for they did not contribute to the growth of the Zyphorian population. No matter how much she tried to resent them with passion, her peers always looked at her with the same pitying gaze. They never saw her as anything more than a vessel for failure. They saw the limitations that defined her and ignored the potential that lived in her mind. Even Zeth, who often loitered around the halls with his smug grin, would appear at the most inconvenient times to remind her of her place. He had a way of getting under her skin with his sharp words, his cruel tone, the way he made her feel small and insignificant, as though everything she had worked for amounted to nothing at all. One day, during a lecture where Nara was explaining her latest theories on intergalactic energy manipulation, Zeth decided to interrupt her in front of the entire class with his typical brand of mockery. Perhaps if you spent less time on these silly theories and more time on what truly matters to our people, you wouldn't be so pathetic, he said, his voice laced with arrogance. As the others laughed, Nara's heart sank. But she didn't let the tremble in her voice escape. She continued on with her research, not allowing Zeth to derail her focus. But in that moment she couldn't help but feel the weight of his words, his insinuations of her worthlessness, settled deep into her chest, like a stone that refused to be lifted there. She was the brightest mind in the room, yet always overlooked, because she couldn't fit into the narrow box that her species had drawn for her. And for all her achievements, the one thing that would grant her acceptance into the greater world of Zephora was something that she could never give them: a future through reproduction, something she had no control over, something she would never be able to change. It was a feeling of hopelessness she had grown accustomed to over the years, but it never made it easier to bear every insult, every dismissive glance chipped away at her spirit, until one day it felt like she was on the verge of breaking. No matter how strong her mind was, no matter how brilliant her theories, she couldn't escape the shadow of her condition. And then came the moment that would change everything. The doors to the lecture hall slid open with a soft hiss, and in stepped a figure that was completely out of place on Zephora, a human soldier. His uniform looked simple, but his posture spoke of strength and authority. He was tall and broad, with eyes that gleamed with experience and determination. But the Zephorians in the room were momentarily distracted by his presence. No one more so than Nara. She had seen humans before they were known to the Zephorians as a resilient race of warriors whose cultures prized individuality, but never had she encountered one in her own academic halls. The soldier stood at the back of the room watching Nara with an unreadable expression as Zeth continued his mocking of her in front of the entire class. The tension in the air thickened with each word that Zeth threw at her, but to Nara's surprise the soldier's gaze did not waver from her. Not once did he look away as Zeth's taunts grew louder. Instead, the soldier took a step forward, breaking the silence. And for the first time in years, Nara felt something stir in her chest, not shame or fear, but curiosity, as the human's voice rang out clear and strong in the room. "Enough," he said, his tone unwavering, like steel. Zeth halted mid-sentence, eyes wide with disbelief at the audacity of the humans speaking in their presence. Yet it wasn't fear that showed on the Zephorian male's face. It was confusion as the human continued. "You have no right to speak to her that way," he said with authority, his eyes locking onto Zeth's with an intensity that made even the bravest of Zephorians pause. Nara didn't know what to make of this sudden interruption, but she couldn't help but feel a flicker of something in her heart. The human wasn't mocking her, he wasn't making her feel small. He was standing up for her in front of everyone, and for the first time in years, someone was treating her as though she were more than just a flaw to be ridiculed. The room fell silent as the human soldier's words lingered in the air. Zeth stood frozen, his expression a mix of disbelief and outrage. How dare this outsider speak to him in such a manner? Did he not realize that the Zephorians were the rulers of this galaxy, that their ways were unquestionable and sacred? But the human was unfazed, his gaze never wavered from Zeth, his posture straight and unyielding. It was a presence that commanded respect in a way that no Zephorian had ever dared to challenge. Before, the other students exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do in this unusual situation. Their society was one of order and hierarchy, where challenges to authority were rare and always punished swiftly. But the human was not intimidated, not by Zeth, not by the roomful of eyes that watched with bated breath. The soldier took another step forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "No one has the right to belittle someone for things they cannot control," he said calmly, his words precise and unwavering. Nara felt a strange warmth spread through her chest at his words. They were simple, but they held weight. They acknowledged something she had buried deep within herself for so long, the pain of being treated as less than everyone else simply because of her condition. Zeph finally recovered from his initial shock and sneered at the human. "And who are you to lecture me on our ways, outsider?" He spat, his voice dripping with venom. The Zyphorian's pride flared as he looked down at the human from his position of power in their society. But the soldier didn't flinch. Instead, he looked directly at Nara, his gaze softening for the first time since entering the room. And for some reason, Nara felt the weight of his attention settle on her like a comforting blanket. "I'm here to speak up for what's right," the soldier said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your worth isn't defined by your ability to bear children, it's defined by who you are and what you can contribute to the world around you." Zeph's anger grew, but before he could retort, the soldier turned his full attention back to the class. "We all have something unique to offer, no matter what anyone tells you." His voice was firm, with a quiet strength that made Nara feel as though something inside her was finally awakening. The others in the room seemed to be holding their breath, unsure of how to react to the boldness of this outsider who had dared to challenge their established norms. Nara could see the flicker of doubt in their eyes as they watched the human's unwavering stance. For the first time, they were questioning whether their way of thinking was truly the right one. And for the first time, Nara didn't feel like she was invisible or broken. She felt seen, as though someone had finally recognized her for more than just a flaw. She had always thought of herself as someone unworthy of attention, someone who would never fit into the grand plan of the Zyphorian future. But the human soldier was offering her something different. He was offering her respect. And with that respect came the possibility of something more, a chance to be valued for who she was beyond the limitations of her condition. The room was silent now, the weight of the human's words settling in the air like a thick fog. Zeph's anger still simmered beneath the surface, but even he could not deny the force of the human's presence. His challenge had been met with something the Zyphorians rarely experienced: humility. And understanding, the soldier's eyes never strayed from Nara as he spoke again. "You are not what they say you are," he said, his voice quieter this time, but no less powerful. "You are a person of value, and I will not stand by and watch them tear you down for something you cannot change." Nora's heart pounded in her chest. She had never heard words like this before, certainly not from anyone in her own species, much less from an outsider, someone who had no reason to care about her or her struggles. And yet here he was standing before her, offering something she had long given up: hope of ever finding compassion, understanding, and acceptance. All she could do was stare at him in stunned silence, her mind racing to process the weight of this moment. Could it be possible that someone from outside her world saw her for who she truly was, rather than as an incomplete version of a Zyphorian? Nara stood there, frozen, her mind racing, the words of the human soldier still echoing in her thoughts. It was like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, a burden she had carried for so long, but had never dared to speak of, now lay bare between them. It felt like a forbidden dream, one she had been too afraid to even hope for. But it was happening right in front of her. The human soldier was standing up for her. He was treating her with something no one on Zephora had ever offered: her respect. Nara had heard the stories of humans, their legendary resilience, their warrior spirit, but never had she imagined they would possess such a rare gift of empathy. The Zyphorians around her were still silent. They watched with disbelief as the human spoke, as if they couldn't fathom how someone from outside their world could have such an effect on them. Their pride had been bruised, their superiority challenged, and yet in the quiet of the room something had changed. The soldier's words had struck a chord deep within Nora's heart, a chord she had long since abandoned. She wanted to believe him, to embrace his words with all her being, but years of torment and rejection held her back. She had spent so long in the shadows of her people's expectations. She couldn't imagine a world where she could be something more than the outcast, the flawed specimen who would never belong, but the soldier's gaze never wavered. He stood firm and resolute in his belief that she was more than what they said she was, more than the sum of her perceived failures. It was in that moment that she finally understood what he was offering. It wasn't pity or charity. He wasn't here to save her from her condition. He was offering her something much more precious, the chance to see herself as worthy of love and respect in her own right. And perhaps most importantly, he was offering her a chance to choose her own path, a path where her value wasn't determined by the biological function that her species demanded of her. It was a path where she could stand tall with her head held high, without the weight of her infertility dragging her down. The silence in the room stretched on, but it wasn't an oppressive silence anymore. It was a pause filled with possibility. The other Xiphorians were still reeling from the soldier's challenge. Their pride had been shaken to its core, but Nara could feel a change in the air. The weight of their expectations was no longer the only thing she had to bear. For the first time, she could hear the sound of her own voice rising in her chest. The fear that had always held her back began to dissipate like fog. In the morning sun, she had lived her life in fear of rejection, afraid to speak her truth, because she knew that her truth was not accepted in this world. But the soldier had given her something no one had ever dared to offer her, a chance to be heard, a chance to be seen, as she truly was. The Xiphorians, who had once been so quick to ridicule her, now stood quietly exchanging uneasy glances as they processed the human's bold words. They were unaccustomed to such defiance from someone outside their culture. They were used to seeing humans as nothing more than primitive soldiers who existed to fight their battles. But this human was different. He was more than a soldier. He was a symbol of something new, a challenge to everything they had ever known. Nora's mind swirled with conflicting emotions. Her head was filled with thoughts of her people, her family, her future. All the things she had been told mattered so much, and yet she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to life than just following the path laid out for her by others, if there was more to her worth than her ability to reproduce, if maybe, just maybe, her true potential lay beyond the rigid expectations of her species. The room remained tense as Nara stood silently, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Her heart raced with uncertainty and excitement, a whirlwind of emotions she had long buried under layers of logic and acceptance. But now they surged to the surface. She felt seen for the first time in years, truly seen, not for her infertility, not for her supposed flaw, but for her mind, her spirit, her worth as an individual. The human soldier's presence was still strong in the room, as if it had imprinted itself onto the very air around them. His words had cracked something open within her, something fragile but real. And for the first time in her life, Nara wondered if there was a place for her beyond the role her people had assigned her, beyond the confines of their expectations. The silence stretched on as the Xiphorians exchanged uncertain glances, their pride wounded by the human's defiance, yet none of them dared speak up. They were too proud, too shocked by the disruption in their carefully controlled world. Zeth, who had once been so quick to belittle her, now stood rigid, his face flushed with anger at the challenge to his authority, yet even he seemed unable to muster the words to retort. It was as though the room had shifted its energy like a storm that could not be ignored, and Nara felt the tremors of change deep within her soul. The human soldier had made her feel something that she had long since abandoned, hope. He had given her a glimpse of something greater than the small life she had resigned herself to, something that was hers to decide. She looked at him for the first time, truly looked at him, and saw something in his eyes, a warmth and sincerity that spoke of understanding without pity, of a connection without expectation. It wasn't just respect he had offered her, it was the chance to choose her own path, a path where her worth wasn't defined by her inability to bear children, but by her own actions, her own choices, her own desires. Nara took a breath, her mind racing as she tried to sort through the turmoil of emotions inside her. Everything she had been taught, everything she had believed about herself, seemed to be crumbling in the face of this human's unwavering belief in her. There was something almost foreign about his words, the idea that she could be more than her biology, that she could choose a future not based on the narrow view her people held, but on something much more expansive, a future where she could create meaning for herself, where she could break free from the chains of expectation that had always bound her, yet the weight of her people's beliefs was still strong. It was hard to imagine a life beyond their judgments. It was hard to imagine a future that didn't involve rejection, a life where she was accepted, not because of her ability to reproduce, but because of who she truly was. The Xiphorians around her still watched with a mix of awe and disbelief. Their way of life had been challenged by the human's presence, and their pride was struggling to process the reality that someone from outside their world could see something in Nara that they had never bothered to look for. The possibility of her true value, her humanity. They had always seen her as broken, incomplete, incapable of contributing to their future, yet the human soldier saw her as a whole person, someone deserving of respect, and the freedom to choose her own path. The tension in the room was palpable, but for the first time in a long while, Nara felt a strange sense of peace. She had spent years fighting against the shame that came with being different, fighting against the loneliness of her condition. But now she realized she didn't have to fight anymore. The soldier had shown her a new way, a way that embraced her for who she was, not for what she lacked. And she found herself at a crossroads, standing at the edge of a decision that would define the rest of her life. Would she continue to live in the shadows of her people's expectations, or would she take the step into the unknown and embrace the chance to define her own future? Nora's mind raced, her heart pounding, as the room seemed to stretch out before her in a blur of thoughts and emotions. She could hardly contain the weight of what had just been set into motion. A world she had always believed would never accept her now seemed full of possibilities. The human soldier had shown her something that had been buried deep inside her for so long, the belief that she had value beyond her infertility, that she was not a failure, but a person capable of making her own choices, a person who could define her own future. But the pressure of her people's expectations was heavy and suffocating. It was hard to imagine stepping outside the narrow life they had set for her, a life where she would always be seen as less than. But the human soldier's words echoed in her mind as a beacon of hope. He had challenged everything she had been told about herself, everything she had been forced to believe about her place in the universe. And for the first time she could feel a spark of defiance stirring within her. It wasn't anger or frustration, but something stronger, something deeper. It was a sense of ownership over her own life, the realization that she could choose to break free from the confines of her people's rigid beliefs and pursue something entirely different. She looked around the room at the other Xiphorians, still staring at her with a mix of confusion and disbelief. Zeth's eyes were wide, his mouth set in a thin line, as if he couldn't decide whether to lash out or retreat. But his power over her was gone in that moment. She could see that the words of the human soldier had shaken him, as well shaken the foundation of everything he thought he knew about superiority, about strength, about what made someone worthy of respect. Nara could feel the tension in the air like a live wire, stretching between her and the rest of the room, the weight of their judgments still pressing down on her. But there was a shift now, a subtle shift that she could feel in the way they looked at her. It was as if they were beginning to question whether they had been wrong all along, whether their way of thinking had kept them trapped in a cycle of pride and arrogance that had prevented them from seeing the truth that every individual was more than their ability to reproduce, more than their biological function, the truth that they all had value that transcended their limitations. Nara felt a surge of something inside her, something that was both terrifying and liberating, the knowledge that she was no longer willing to stay silent, no longer willing to be defined by what she could not do. The soldier's gaze never left her, his presence steady and unwavering. He had shown her a path that led away from the familiar world of Xiphora and into the unknown, a path where she could carve out her own identity, free from the judgment and rejection that had always followed her. She could feel the door to that future opening wide before her, and the fear that had always held her back began to fade. The uncertainty remained, but it no longer felt insurmountable. The choice was hers now, to step forward into the future that awaited or remain in the shadows of the past. The human soldier had given her the courage to even consider a future outside the rigid expectations of her species, something she had never dared to do before. She felt a flicker of something new, something alive inside her, like a flame that had been lit in the darkest corner of her heart. and she realized with a clarity she had never known that she didn't need to accept the life that had been handed to her. She didn't need to let her infertility define her worth. She could choose to live on her own terms. And in that moment, Nara made a silent vow to herself. She would not let fear or shame hold her back any longer. She would step into the future. She desired a future where she was valued for who she truly was. Nara took a slow, steady breath as the room around her seemed to blur into the background, her focus entirely on the decision that had just begun to take root within her heart. She had always been afraid of what her people would think of her if she stepped out of line, if she dared to defy the expectations that had been placed on her since birth. But now, for the first time in her life, those fears seemed distant like shadows, fading in the light of a new possibility. The human soldier stood before her, unwavering, his presence a constant reminder of the strength it took to stand up for what was right. In the face of overwhelming odds, he had shown her something she had never thought possible. He had shown her that she could be more than what her species saw her as, more than just a defective part of their machine, a broken piece that could not contribute to their future. She could feel a shift within herself, a quiet confidence building like a foundation, rising from the ground up. She had spent so many years hiding in the shadows, believing that her worth was defined by something she had no control over, that her inability to bear children had made her less than everyone else. But now she realized that she was so much more than that. She was capable of contributing to the world in ways that had nothing to do with reproduction, in ways that were uniquely hers. Her mind, her creativity, her vision. Those were the things that made her who she was, and no amount of scorn or mockery could take that away from her. She looked at the other Xiphorians, who were still standing there watching the scene unfold. Their expressions were a mix of confusion and disbelief, as if they were unsure how to react to what was happening. They had never seen a Xiphorian stand up to their ways in such a bold and open manner, and certainly never from an outsider, but the human soldier had done just that, and Nara had never felt more alive. The pressure to conform to the expectations of her society was still there, but it was no longer suffocating her. It was no longer the thing that dictated her every move. She could see that she had choices now, choices that were hers alone to make, and the weight of those choices no longer seemed as daunting as it once had. The human soldier's presence gave her the strength to face the uncertainty that lay ahead. And as she looked at him for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip a beat. It was the same warmth, the same quiet strength that had drawn her in from the very beginning. But there was something else too, something more than just respect, something that she hadn't been able to place until now, something that made her stomach flutter with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He wasn't just standing up for her because it was the right thing to do. He wasn't just offering her a chance to be seen for who she truly was. There was something deeper in the way he looked at her, something that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, he saw something in her that no one else had ever bothered to see before. But before she could fully process a thought, the silence in the room was broken by Zeth, his voice sharp and laced with venom. "This is absurd," he spat, his eyes flicking back and forth between Nara and the human soldier, as if he couldn't decide who to direct his anger at. "You think this outsider has any place here, that he can change anything about us, that he can make us see things differently? You are all fools if you let him lead you astray." His words were harsh and filled with venom, but they no longer held the weight they once had. They felt hollow, as if his authority had been stripped away in front of them. Zeth's eyes flickered to the others in the room, who were still standing in stunned silence, and Nara could see the doubt creeping into their expressions. They weren't so sure anymore. They weren't so sure that everything they had been told about their superiority was the truth. Nara's heart swelled with a quiet hope she had not known in years. She had never been able to speak up before, but now, with the human soldier's words still ringing in her ears, she realized she didn't need to fear the judgment of others. She didn't need their approval to know her own worth. And for the first time in her life, she felt the power of her own voice rising from deep within her. "Zeth," she said, her voice calm but steady, "you don't get to decide my worth anymore." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she had been holding inside, all the years of shame and silence. They were finally set free. The room went still at Nara's words, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Zeth's mouth tightened, as if her declaration had struck a chord deep within him. He had always been the one who held power over her, always the one who reminded her of her inferiority. But now her words seemed to unravel, that hold piece by piece. She could see the shock in his eyes, the confusion flickering behind the anger he had so carefully cultivated for so long. It was as if the foundation of his authority had begun to crack and crumble. And for the first time, Nara could see the fragility that lay beneath it. All she had spent years fearing him, fearing the judgment of her people, fearing that she would never be enough. But now, as she stood there facing him, her heart steady and strong, she realized that his power had never been as absolute as she had once believed. It had always been built on the fear of others, the fear of challenging the status quo, the fear of questioning what they had been taught to believe. But now that fear was gone, she could feel it slipping away like sand through her fingers, and in its place, there was something new, something more powerful, the power of her own voice, the power of her own choices. Zeth took a step forward, his expression twisted in fury, but Nara didn't flinch. She held her ground, her gaze unwavering, as she met his challenge head on. The other Xiphorians stood around them, unsure of what to do, their eyes flicking between Nara and Zeth, as if waiting for one of them to make the next move. But Nara was done waiting. She was done letting others decide her fate. She had already made her decision. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their validation. Her worth was not for them to determine. It was for her to decide. She turned her gaze to the human soldier, standing behind her, his eyes still locked on her, with a warmth and understanding that made her feel seen in a way she had never felt before. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an outsider. She didn't feel like something broken, something incomplete. She felt whole and powerful. And she knew in that moment that she had made the right choice. The soldier had not come here to fix her. He had come to show her that she was already enough, that her value did not lie in what she could or could not do, but in who she was as a person. Zeth seemed to sense the change in the room, his anger flaring even higher. But Nara was no longer afraid of him, or what he represented. She had broken free of the mental chains that had kept her bound for so long, and nothing could stop her now. She could see the other Xiphorians beginning to shift their weight, their eyes no longer focused solely on Zeth, but on her. They were beginning to see her not as the flawed outcast they had always known, but as someone who deserved their respect. She felt the room slowly start to shift around her. The air seemed to crackle with energy, as if the very atmosphere was changing. And for the first time she realized she wasn't alone. There was a growing sense of unity in the room as the other Xiphorians started to question what they had always believed, what they had always been told about their superiority, and the worth of others. They were looking at her differently now. And it felt like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a stormy sky. Nara felt a hand on her shoulder, and she turned to see the human soldier standing there, his eyes full of quiet pride. He hadn't asked for anything in return for his actions. He hadn't tried to change her. He had simply offered her the chance to see herself differently, to see the strength she had always carried within her. And for that she was grateful more than words could express. She gave him a small nod, and he smiled back at her. It was a smile that spoke of understanding and trust, a smile that told her she was not alone in this journey. The room was still silent, but the silence was different now. It was no longer heavy with judgment or fear. It was filled with possibility. And Nara knew that whatever happened next, she had already taken the most important step. She had reclaimed her voice, and she would not let anyone take it from her again. The silence in the room stretched out like a living thing, heavy and still, as if the very air was waiting for something to shift. And in that moment it did. Nara stood tall, her heart pounding, but her mind clear. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. She could feel the eyes of the Xiphorians on her, but she no longer felt their judgment, their scorn. She had shed the weight of their expectations. Like an old skin one, she no longer needed to wear it. Was as though they were seeing her for the first time, really seeing her as a person, not just a symbol of their narrow ideals. And in their gaze she saw something she hadn't expected, not pity, but respect. Slowly but surely they were starting to understand that the soldier's words had meaning, that there was more to a person than what they could produce. That value did not lie in fertility or conformity, but in individuality, in the freedom to choose who they wanted to be. And Nara felt a surge of pride rise within her. She had broken the chains that had bound her for so long, and in doing so she had sparked something within the Xiphorians, a seed of change. They had always prided themselves on their strength and superiority, but they had never considered the strength that came from within, the strength that came from choosing to be something more than what they were told to be. Szeth's eyes flickered from Nara to the human soldier, then back to her again, his expression no longer one of outright anger, but something more uncertain, something that spoke of doubt and confusion. He took a deep breath, as if gathering himself before speaking. His voice was strained, but still commanding. You think you can just walk away from all this, that you can defy the ways of our people, and nothing will happen? You think you will be accepted like this? Nara didn't flinch at his words. They had once been enough to make her shrink back to hide in the shadows, but now they had no power over her. She had found her strength, and it was no longer tied to the opinions of others. Her voice was steady and sure as she met his gaze. I don't need your acceptance, Szeth, not anymore. She said the words simple but full of finality. I'm not asking for permission, I'm choosing my own path. There was a beat of silence as Szeth stood there looking at her, as though trying to comprehend what had just transpired. Nara could see that he was struggling with the concept that someone from his own species had dared to reject the very foundation of everything they had been taught about power, about dominance, about what made someone worthy in his eyes. She had always been the outcast, the one who didn't belong. But now she was standing before him with the quiet strength of someone who had finally found her place in the world, a place that wasn't defined by his standards or anyone else's. And as the realization hit Szeth, his shoulders seemed to slump slightly, as if the weight of his own pride had suddenly become too much to bear. He didn't speak again. Instead, he turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence behind him. And Nara knew that he wasn't just walking away from her, but from everything he had believed to be true about the world and about power. The rest of the Xiphorians remained in place, their eyes shifting uncertainly from one to the other, as if waiting for someone to take charge. But Nara wasn't waiting anymore. She wasn't waiting for their approval or permission. She was taking charge of her own life. The human soldier stood beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the midst of the chaos she had always feared. She could see the quiet pride in his eyes, and it made her heart swell with emotion. He hadn't come here to fight her battles. He hadn't come to save her. He had simply given her the courage to save herself. And in that moment, Nara realized something else. She hadn't just found her strength. She had found a new sense of belonging, a belonging that wasn't tied to the approval of the Xiphorians or anyone else, but to the simple truth that she was worthy of respect, love, and freedom to choose her own destiny. And as she stood there with the human soldier by her side, Nara knew that the world was no longer the same. She had taken the first step in breaking the cycle of fear and shame that had plagued her for so long. And now she was ready to walk forward into a future that was entirely her own, one that no one could take from her.